We wanted to get to our sort of big showcase story interview today because, as many of you know, attempts to legalize sports betting in Minnesota have been going on for so long that it's sort of practically reached this urban legend status. So a little background, and bear with me because I do want to set this up so that we can spend the time with our guests really kind of getting into the nitty gritty. But the background on this is that in 2018, the Supreme Court told the states it's up to each of you to decide if sports gambling should be legal. And every year since then, there's been a bill in Minnesota to try to legalize it. And every year since then, it's been voted down. This last session, as we headed into summer, there was actually a breakthrough for supporters. For the first time, there was this bipartisan agreement on a bill. However, it was too late. The clock struck midnight. It just was too late for them to vote. So, well, we're going to break down a couple of things that were in that bill, kind of give you a reset of where we left off, a couple of examples here. And I don't have graphics, so I apologize, but you'll just have to kind of bear with me here. So tribal casinos would get exclusive control of any new betting, and then in exchange, the tribes would put some of the state revenue into the tracks and charitable gaming. A proposed 22% state tax on net winnings would only apply to mobile betting, not the ones people would place in actual casinos. And then a lot of people do fantasy sports, right? Daily fantasy games are already legal. This bill would control how and when certain types of bets are made, and then when sports books can send a better information, push notifications to bettors, when they can do it, how they can do it. That's all included in there as well. All right, just to give you some perspective here, and a lot of people sort of lean into this argument for why they want it here. Minnesota, one of just only a few states that has yet to legalize it in some way, shape, or form. So 38 states, the District of Columbia, have it in some form or another. For example, just to our east in Wisconsin, you do have to make your bet in person. That's one of the stipulations there. Most states, though, do it both online and in person. There are currently 10 states, and Minnesota is one of them, that just haven't touched this yet. But you can see, of course, the states that border us have legalized it in some way. All right, so let's get to it. Joining me now, the man who tried for, 6 years to try to make sports betting legal in Minnesota, former Republican Representative Pat Garofalo, now president of the Minnesota Grocers Association, and then current State Senator John Marty, DFLer, who's been a lawmaker for nearly 40 years. It's been a long time, John, decades, and you've been working really hard to keep sports betting out of Minnesota. So thank you first, both, for being here.
Well, thanks for having us, Amy.
You bet.
Yes, glad to be with you.
So, Senator Marty, let's start with you. The legislature starts back up here in about a week. This morning, though, you made a move. Maybe we could call it a preemptive strike of sorts. You held an informational meeting. I think it was the Senate Finance Committee, and it sounds like you were, I didn't get a chance to get debriefed on it, so I apologize, but it sounds like you had some gambling addiction experts, among other things. So tell us what you talked about, and do you feel like you moved any needles this morning?
Sure. Well, first of all, there have been Patrick's been author of a lot of them, but there have been over 30 legislative hearings on sports betting bills in the last several years. And not one of them they've all focused on the mechanics of the bills, understandably, and also who profits from the bills, whether it's tribes or tracks or whom. But very little and no hearings have focused on the harms, the economic harms, the social harms, the health harms because of it. And gambling addiction is very deadly in some ways. It's got the highest suicide rate of any form of addiction. Like 1 in 5 gambling addicts have an informational only hearing, wasn't on any legislation on sports betting, but on the costs, the harms to people from legalizing sports bookmaking. And I would add one other thing, and that is to distinguish the fact, I argue we already have sports betting. If Patrick or I or anybody else wants to bet, you could bet on the Vikings-Lions game last week, whether you want to bet with friends or strangers or anybody, you're allowed to do that. The thing that this bill would legalize is legal sports bookmaking, where companies that practice ways to make you bet more because they profit off of that. That's where the question, should we allow the bookmaking into Minnesota? Because you can already bet.
And so I'll toss it over to Pat at this point. And I think the argument from a lot of people are saying, yes, it's here. Illegal betting is happening as well. So why not just regulate it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but of course, this has been you've been beating the drum on that for years now. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, quite a few years. Well, thanks again for having me. And I hope I'm respectful and deferential to the powerful chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Marty. Please don't kill any of my bills this year if we disagree on this, Senator. But no, I think that Senator Marty, he does portray some factual points there, and that is that any form of gambling, whether it's sports gambling, slot machines, or other forms, there are costs and there are harms to that. There are societal harms to gambling. But if you look at the state of Minnesota and our history and present, when we've been asked posed the question, do we want to ban this and have a black market, or do we want to regulate it and provide assistance? We have chosen the regulatory path. The same thing with sports gambling can apply to lottery, slot machines, table casino games on our tribal casinos, the Powerball, parimutuel wagering. These are all things that we have addressed in the past, and we have made the decision as a state that we are far better off to regulate these items, have them be above board, have consumer protections, and try to mitigate the harms of these industries, as opposed to having them be in a black market where, again, let's be honest, the black market is very efficient, right? They'll extend you credit, they'll meet with you in person, but a lot of times it hides those abuses. And by having a responsible, orderly gaming industry, we've decided as a state that's the best way to do it. Sports gambling is really no different than any of those other items.
Yeah. Senator Marty, I'm curious. So clearly your number one jobs, both of you and Pat at the time, was to represent your constituents. So Senator Marty, what have your constituents told you? And do you look at the numbers and say, well, the majority of people do want some sort of a balance here? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, a couple of things. One, in terms of, I'm hearing from people who support it and who oppose it. I think almost everybody thinks adults should be able to gamble. You can gamble on anything. Hope you didn't bet too much on the Vikings last week, but you can gamble anywhere you want with friends, strangers, and so on. It's only when you have the bookmaker, the entity that profits from the more bets you make, because that's when you have the VIP hosts, the people coming in and egging people on to gamble more. And so I'm not hearing, I think the polls, California 2 years ago, they had 2 polls of voter initiatives, the time where you have actual votes cast. They spent $400 million on 2 sports betting initiatives, one of which was to allow betting on-site, casino and racetrack and so on. And there was another one that would allow online sports betting. The one that was allowing it site only lost by more than 2-to-1 margin. They spent $400 million on these initiatives. They went more than 2-to-1 margin. 67% voted no. And for the online one, it was 81% voted no. In other words, I'm not sure this is that popular of a thing. And to Patrick's concern about regulating, yeah, I would agree. If we could get rid of the offshore and the illegal market and replace it with this, that's true. One of our witnesses today was saying that after Massachusetts regulated it, Massachusetts Gaming Commission, which has been very favorable to it, they were supporting it. They said that the offshore betting went from 4% to 18% a couple of years ago. The sports betting has gone up in the illegal market. And that's partly because kids who aren't allowed to gamble in the regulated market, they're seeing all the ads, all the promotions. It's becoming acceptable. So they're continuing to bet, but they're betting in the offshore illegal market. So it doesn't displace them. That's the myth that it's going to replace that.
And Pat, I'm just going to add to that and then ask you to respond. So we have seen, because other states obviously have passed this, they have some form of legal sportsbook betting. So the huge increases that I'm seeing in some of the research here in likelihood of bankruptcy, debt collection, drops in credit scores, draining people who are already low income. There was even one study I found from the University of Oregon that linked sports gambling to an increased risk of domestic violence. So how does this bill try to mitigate those things? Can it do enough?
Well, again, whether it's gambling or any other vice, when taken to the extreme, there can be negative impacts from it. I would be skeptical of studies that draw a direct correlation between the expansion or the allowance of sports gambling and the tying into it of a negative outcome. Keep in mind that many of these states have many other factors going on. We're seeing record credit card delinquency rates in the country. That's tied more to the economy stalling out and to higher interest rates and other factors. But that being said, I do think it's important to understand that any form of gambling does have negative side effects. We've already made this decision as a state that we're much better off regulating that. So I think some of the measures in the bill right now, I think are good in terms of making sure that they're licensed, regulated, that they're reputable. Something that is not in the bill right now that I think actually Senator Marty and I would agree on, the minimum sports gambling age should be 21. It should not be 18. The current version of the bill says you got to be 21 if you're going to do it mobile, but if you're at a tribal casino and you're 18, 19, or 20, you can bet on sports. I'm guessing that Senator Marty and I agree on that if you're going to legalize this, there's a difference between the impulse control of an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old. Anyone who knows any man knows this. So I do think that's something that is a common sense measure that could be incorporated into the bill. But candidly, right now, I think the biggest disputes right now around sports gambling, they're not about that philosophical question of regulate or not regulate. I think the bigger issue is who gets to operate it and who profits from it. And I'm hoping that the stakeholders, whether they're tribal casinos, the charities, or our parimutuel, our horse racing tracks, that they're able to reach an agreement on that. And I think they're pretty close to doing that.
I was going to ask you that too. And just to quickly follow up, Pat, if you could just bring us up to speed, because there were so many moving parts. There were lawsuits and things when we last left this. Can you let us know where we are now as we head into this legislative session with some of those other players?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just again point out that I'm former state representative Pat Garofalo, so I want to make sure I'm not being misconstrued as speaking on behalf of anyone or anything like that. But I think that right now the parties have been talking. They've had previous conversations at the end of session. I am not aware of any current litigation that is ongoing. There's been quite a few disputes. But at the end of the day, I think this is an opportunity to have a win-win-win that's good for the charities, like it was last year, good for the racetracks, like it was, and good for Minnesota's tribal casinos. The devil will be in the details, but ultimately, if there's agreement among those stakeholders, I think the legislature on a bipartisan, bicameral basis can move forward with this. If there's not an agreement, then I think it's unlikely it moves forward, and I think we remain as one of the few states where there is no legal sports gambling option.
And Senator Marty, go ahead. Yes, please respond.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, when we talk about the states surrounding us, 3 of the 4 states around us only allow betting on casino property. They do not allow mobile sports betting. And the mobile is the most addictive. Our cell phones are they are addictive in their own, and then you put an addictive product on it, it makes that. And the impact, the legalization has greatly increased the amount of betting on it to great profit for certain industries. But the bankruptcy, one of the studies this morning said that statewide, the average number of bankruptcies in a state goes up by 27% 3 or 4 years after this. That's a small number of people that declare bankruptcies. Most of us, none of us are hoping to declare bankruptcy, but the number of bankruptcies actually filed in states have gone up by more than a quarter in the states after they've legalized sports betting. And you can measure it, what year they joined allowed sports betting and what's happened to it since then. So these measures, the quote, regulated and safety measures in the bills aren't sufficient to protect against the economic and social and other harms.
Okay.
And Senator Marty, I would respectfully just reply that a lot of that economic data is inaccurate because you had the shock waves from COVID. And so, yes, as things were legalized in 2019 and being implemented in 2020, we all saw that the COVID shutdown, the absolute upturning of the U.S. economy played a much more significant role than whether
this particular study measured what happened in Iowa after this compared to Minnesota and other states. Those states saw a 27% increase in bankruptcy filing statewide in the 3 or 4 years after that state did it. It was state by state. It was not a national thing. And COVID affected Iowa and Minnesota similarly, but one state had the legal online sports betting, the other didn't.
And just again, to be respectful, Senator, that in the state of Iowa, a majority of the sports gamblers are from outside of the state of Iowa. They're from Minnesota, they were from Illinois, Missouri to the south, and Nebraska on the west. So
the study was of Iowans, however, the bankruptcy rates in Iowa, not the Minnesotans betting in Iowa. It was Iowans and so on in other states. It was based on that. It was a very good study, and it's a reputable study, and we had presentations today on all of that, which is, I think, important for the legislative debate.
And I agree, Senator, I agree with you completely. Legislators need to understand both the benefits and the drawbacks of any sort of regulatory change in any vice, whether it's it's electronic poll tabs or otherwise. You are 100% right about that.
And along those lines, gentlemen, and thank you for the civil conversation. I think this is so refreshing to a lot of us who see a lot of the opposite on our evening news.
Well, Senator Marty's a pretty good guy, so it's difficult.
Pat and I have worked together a lot in the past as well. So.
Yeah, no, definitely can feel the respect there. So let's talk, Senator Marty, though, about the votes that would be needed to stop this, because we could talk all day about some of the details and the different layers to this, but ultimately it would come down to a vote. So your DFL colleague, Senator Matt Klein, is the one actually leading this effort to legalize sports betting. So two Democrats here on opposite sides. Clearly there's some party overlap when it comes to this issue, which is why it's been tricky to get to a solution. But what is your strategy this session? I mean, are there new legislators in play? What are you looking at to get a stop to this?
Sure. Well, we're trying to talk with other legislators about the problems. And it's, as you mentioned, it's certainly a nonpartisan one. The author of the Senate bill is a DFLer, as am I. We have Republicans who are working with us on trying to educate people about the harms. It's clearly a bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. And I think we're trying to say we want to make sure all of our colleagues hear the concerns, because all of the hearings in the past have focused on who benefits in debates, whether it should be tribes or tracts or whom. But very little on the people who are impacted by it, either the domestic violence concerns or the poverty or the people going in bankruptcy. So I think it's important. I think Pat would agree that the Republicans have a lot of supporters and DFLers do, and both sides have opposition, and so it's not a party breakdown on this bill.
Mm-hmm. And before I let you answer, Pat, in the vein of keeping it real here, Senator Marty, when you look ahead to this legislative session, are you looking at sort of an uphill climb? Are you looking at a huge mountain in front of you, or do you feel like the path is pretty flat?
I think it's pretty uneven, but I don't know whether up or down, because a lot of people who had not spoken out on it before are now saying, hey, I got concerns about that. And again, I think every year we wait, the chances of it happening are less great because of the fact we're getting economic analysis from other states, and the states that thought they were going to get new revenue from this are finding, well, it really just wasn't what it was cracked up to be, because most of those dollars go out, a lot of those dollars go out of the state.
Okay. Pat, one more quick question for you, which is, I think people who want this to happen on their minds is how quickly can we turn this around, because things do not move quickly, as we see with cannabis and things like that. So what do you see moving forward as far as timing?
Well, if I had that crystal ball, I'd be a pretty lucky guy. Right now we just had an election. There was a big change in the House of Representatives, and some legislators may not even be showing up on the first day. I know Senator Marty's going to be there. I know that, but so there's a lot of things that need to be organizationally figured out. And I would say the more that fighting goes on, the less likely it is. As much of a proponent as I am of sports gambling, this is not a must-pass bill this session, and I want to see it happen. But it's fair for people like Senator Marty and those who are both proponents and opponents of sports gambling to highlight that there's other things that must get taken care of before we move on to sports gambling. So hopefully the legislature is able to organize, work together, collaborate. And this is one of the things, as Senator Marty said, you have to have there's bipartisan support, there's bipartisan opposition. I'm just hoping by the end of this legislative session, we're not going to make anyone go to Iowa to have some fun.
No, nobody wants to do that, right, guys? Let's face it. No shade to Iowa. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both. Former Representative Pat Garofalo, current president of the Minnesota Grocers Association, and State Senator John Marty. You both have been working respectively on this, and we thank you both for your time today.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you both.
All right, take care.